James was engrossed in analyzing fresh test data, a monotonous yet critical part of the month-long project he and his team had dedicated themselves to on the test vehicle. While the task wasn't thrilling, he meticulously worked through the correlations and tabulations required for a comprehensive analysis. His focus was disrupted by the buzz of his phone, signaling a new text notification. At first, he ignored the interruption, unconcerned about who might have sent it. It wasn't until he paused to stretch that he glanced at the screen, curiosity sparked by the notification. The sender's number was unfamiliar, though it had a local area code. Instinctively, James considered dismissing it as spam, but then he hesitated, speculating it could be a colleague using an unregistered number. When he finally opened the message, the shock was immediate. The screen displayed an explicit image, intimately graphic and leaving little to the imagination. His mind reeled as he processed the vulgar photo, a close-up of a woman's private parts, visibly showing the aftermath of recent intercourse. The accompanying text read, "Look closely, you still have time. Bradley's, 6. Initially, he dismissed it as a crude mistake or a misguided attempt at solicitation. However, as he scrutinized the photo again, a small detail gripped him with icy certainty, a distinct mole near the woman's intimate area. His stomach sank. That mole belonged to Linda, his wife. James's mind raced, frantically trying to rationalize the situation. Linda was supposed to be en route to Boston for a vital work engagement. How could this image exist? What was he looking at? His thoughts spiraled as he tried to recall her exact itinerary. Her flight was scheduled to land in Boston at 4:30 p.m., and it was now just past 5:15 p.m. Normally, Linda would check in upon arrival, but he reasoned she might be tied up with her team. Despite the turmoil within him, he chose to respond to the text, opting for cautious engagement rather than rash confrontation. His reply was brief but calculated, not exactly original, but predictable. "Who are you? How did you get this image? Am I supposed to meet you at Bradley's?" Setting his phone aside, James resolved to head to Bradley's and uncover the truth himself. He sent Linda a casual text to maintain a sense of normalcy. "How was your flight? I'm grabbing a quick bite. Call me when you're free." He needed answers but wanted to approach the situation carefully, gathering as much information as possible. As he walked to his car, another buzz from his phone caught his attention. He expected it to be Linda, but it was a reply from the mystery sender. "I'll be there, but I'm sure you'll find someone more interesting than me." James's unease deepened as he drove toward Bradley's, a 30-minute journey that felt interminable. At 5:40 p.m., his phone chimed again, this time with a message from Linda. "Crazy time with the team. We'll call you later before bed. Love you." He set her message aside, too consumed by the impending encounter to respond. Arriving at Bradley's at 6:12 p.m., James's heart raced as he parked his car. The texter hadn't given any clues about who to look for, so he assumed they'd recognize him first. Still, their cryptic comment about someone more interesting lingered, leaving him uneasy. Was he walking into a trap? His mind reeled with possibilities. Stepping inside, James paused to let his eyes adjust to the pub's dim lighting. He scanned the room, spotting a dining area ahead and a bar to his left. Choosing a seat at the end of the bar, he ordered a draft beer and surveyed the crowd, his tension mounting. Then, his gaze landed on a man delivering drinks to a nearby table. His heart stopped as he recognized a familiar face among the diners, Linda. She was dressed to kill in a little black dress and pearls, her radiant smile lighting up the table. James moved toward her with mechanical precision, his legs heavy as lead. Linda's smile faltered the moment she noticed him, her expression shifting to sheer panic. Ignoring her silent plea, James marched to the table, his anger boiling over. Without a word, he grabbed a fistful of the well-dressed man's hair and yanked him backward. The man yelped as his drinks crashed to the floor. As the man stumbled, James released him and prepared to deliver a punch, but the target scrambled out of range and fell to the ground. James recognized him, Chris. Fixing him with a glare, he growled, "Stay down," his voice steely with restrained rage. Chris complied, drenched in spilled drinks and too shaken to respond. Turning to Linda, James found the table dead silent. Familiar faces, her co-workers, stared at him, people who had shared dinners and laughs at his home. Their betrayal stung, but someone among them had clearly tipped him off. He briefly considered outing the whistleblower, but dismissed the idea. It didn't matter. Addressing Linda, he spoke with cold finality. "I'm going home. If there's any chance of saving this marriage, you'd better come with me now." The weight of her decision hung in the air as the room remained still, all eyes on her. Linda nodded hesitantly, her expression guarded. Before she could rise, James held up a hand, signaling her to wait. He turned his attention to Grace Thompson and David Mitchell, seated nearby. Directing his gaze first at Grace, he asked, "Does John think you're in Boston tonight?" Then, turning to David, he added, "And Emily, does she think the same?" Their unwillingness to meet his eyes gave him the answer he needed. The realization that at least one, if not all, of Linda's colleagues were complicit made his stomach churn. The drive home blurred past him, his thoughts a chaotic mix of anger and disbelief. He pulled into the driveway, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. Inside, he grabbed a beer and collapsed onto the living room couch, trying to untangle his thoughts. He knew John Thompson and Emily Mitchell fairly well, but the others at the table were virtual strangers. Should he involve David or Emily in his search for answers? After some deliberation, he decided on a middle ground, sending them a brief and deliberately vague text. "Just heard Linda's travel plans changed. You might want to follow up." It felt like enough to plant a seed without escalating matters unnecessarily. 20 minutes later, the sound of the garage door broke his train of thought. Linda was home. He stayed put, waiting in the living room as she entered. She was still wearing her little black dress, but had shed the provocative heels and jewelry. Calmly, she walked into the room and sat on the sofa across from him. James said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them, knowing full well its power in drawing out the truth. Predictably, Linda broke first. "It's not what you think," she began, but James raised his hand, cutting her off. "You don't know what I think, Linda. Don't assume. I'm not interested in an elaborate explanation. It won't change anything. We're both engineers. We know there's rarely a satisfying answer to a why. It's just an attempt to rationalize bad decisions. So, let's skip that. Instead, let's stick to the basics. How long? How many times? Do our friends know, apart from the ones who were cheating tonight? Am I the punchline of some cruel office joke as your clueless husband?" "James, no. It's not like that at all," Linda protested, her voice rising defensively. "Our travel plans shifted, and instead of flying home only to leave again tomorrow, Chris suggested we stay here and take a rest day. It was practical." James's brow furrowed. "I didn't see the entire team at Bradley's. Where were the others?" She hesitated, then admitted, "Some stayed home one more night. They'll meet us at the airport tomorrow." "But you lied to me," James pointed out, his tone sharp. "And you seemed very comfortable with Chris. Is there something between you and the star engineer? Because tonight didn't exactly scream professionalism." Linda, clearly flustered, deflected. "Chris is a decent guy, and he convinced Bradley's owners not to press charges. You should be grateful for that." James's eyes widened in disbelief. "Grateful," he repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. "I don't care about Chris or whether charges are pressed. If he hadn't stumbled, I'd have knocked him out. Spending a night in jail doesn't scare me. In fact, it might have made for an interesting story in court." He paused, his gaze piercing. "Do you love him?" She froze, visibly grappling with her response. James let the silence hang, refusing to break it. Finally, she blurted, "He's not my boyfriend. There's nothing between us. Yes, I should have told you about the plan change, but it felt irrelevant. Whether I was in Boston or here, you weren't expecting me home. I was still focused on my team. We were just having dinner before turning in for the night. You didn't need to act like a lunatic. You embarrassed me in front of my colleagues." James calmly unlocked his phone, pulled up the incriminating text, and slid it across the coffee table toward her. The color drained from her face as recognition dawned. Her bravado crumbled, and this time, she spoke more carefully. He retrieved the phone and activated a voice recorder, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Go on," he prompted. "Our team is close," she started haltingly. In ways that go beyond work. The group at Bradley's tonight. They're the ones who've been putting in extra hours for the proposal. You know how much I've worked on this pitch. Somewhere along the line, after Chris became program manager, things evolved. We spent a lot of time together, and I got drawn to him. It just happened. Just happened? James interrupted, his voice cutting. We both know falling into bed doesn't just happen. Those are choices. Conscious decisions. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. So, about 6 months? That's when Chris joined, right? She nodded reluctantly. And the team, he pressed. All of you. She nodded again. Chris said it fosters trust, builds unity. Unity? Is that how you rationalize turning your team into some bizarre swingers club? James asked, his tone laced with disdain. That's crude, Linda snapped. It's not like that. It's about deeper connections. I feel more bonded to Chris and my team than ever. James shook his head, sensing her conviction would only dig a deeper rift between them. You might want to prepare for some changes on your team, he warned darkly. What did you do? Linda's voice trembled. James, please don't drag others into this. It'll only make things worse. Let them decide for themselves. Focus on us. Us? James scoffed. There hasn't been an us for months, Linda. I can't stay silent and pretend this didn't happen. David and Emily deserve better than the lies you're all spinning. I care about them far more than I do about Grace or John, for that matter. He paused, his tone firm. And yes, I let them know about your so-called change in plans. Her face fell as the full weight of his words settled between them. How they handle this with their spouses is entirely up to them. I can live with my decision, James said firmly. Linda's voice rose in defiance. James, you're blowing this way out of proportion. Do you realize we're the most productive team in Chromerica Incorporated's history? You've benefited from it too. Our meetings might have been on Wednesdays, but I never denied you access to me whenever you needed it. So yes, I've slept with the team, but you never noticed. And that photo you showed me? You really want to know? Her sneer was laced with venom. That was taken right after Chris finished inside me. That's right, your loving wife. And guess what? Grace snapped the picture just before she went down on me. So now you know. You've never had seconds from me, James. Never tasted another man's seed. Because if you didn't know, it didn't happen, right? James sat in stunned silence as the layers of deceit and betrayal unraveled before him. His mind reeled, struggling to comprehend how deep the deception ran. Linda, her fury now in full force, pressed on. And now, just because you know, because your fragile ego can't handle it, you want to throw away everything my team and I have achieved? Do you realize how much is at stake here? James's anger simmered, barely held in check. On the drive home from Bradley's, he'd briefly entertained the notion of forgiving Chris, but that flicker of hope was now thoroughly extinguished. He didn't need to hear any more, but Linda wasn't finished. No, James, you're not getting off the hook that easily, she snapped. You're going to pick up your phone and text David and Emily back. You'll tell them you spoke to me, and that we were stranded in Atlanta but have morning reservations. That's the story, and Grace and John will back it up. You'll support them, and that's final. Do you even understand what's at risk here? Millions, James. Millions. Your feelings don't matter right now. Send the text, and then we can talk about our next steps. James's voice was icy as he responded. Next steps? There are no next steps, Linda. You're leaving. You, Chris, and your twisted little team can carry on however you want, but not in my life. We're done. I'll be contacting a lawyer this week to start the process. It's simple, 50-50 split. You keep your retirement, I keep mine. But as far as I'm concerned, you can head back to Boston or wherever the hell you're going with Chris and call it a win for your team. Linda's demeanor shifted instantly. Her tone softened, almost pleading. James, please, send those texts. If we lose Grace or John before the presentation, the company could take a major hit. We're talking millions. That's tens, maybe hundreds of thousands in commissions and bonuses for us. Imagine what we could do with that money. Just you and me, traveling anywhere we want. Forget this, and I'll prove my loyalty to you. Don't let some irrational fear over meaningless encounters ruin everything we've built. Chris says I'm on the fast track to executive status. In a few years, we'll have everything we've ever dreamed of. Don't you want that for us? James shook his head, his resolve unwavering. Just leave, Linda. Before he could react, he felt a sharp blow to his back, knocking the wind out of him as he crumpled to the floor. A knee pressed hard into his spine, pinning him in place. Don't hurt him too much, Linda said, her voice void of remorse. Chris leaned down, his smug face mere inches from James's. Still deciding whether to break your nose? He taunted. James's thoughts raced. Linda's shown her true allegiance. This isn't just betrayal, it's an ambush. Chris sneered, let's see whose nose gets broken tonight. He barked an order. Get his damn phone and type those texts for him. We don't have time for this nonsense. Someone grabbed James, attempting to pull him to his feet. James feigned injury, letting his captor struggle under his weight. The labored breathing and weak grip confirmed his suspicions. This was no soldier or fighter, just a desk jockey trying to play enforcer. As he regained his composure, James's mind shifted to the skills he'd honed alongside the elite crews of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, SOAR, based out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. While his engineering team wasn't on the same level as the operatives they supported, they'd shared enough missions to pick up valuable lessons, including how to handle close-quarters confrontations. James and his crew had earned the respect of these warriors by designing and refining equipment that ensured safe entries and exits from the most dangerous locations imaginable. The 160th, along with their formidable passengers, valued the work deeply. Among them was Master Sergeant Mark Davis, a legendary figure in the SOAR community. His reputation for bravery, leadership, and an unyielding commitment to never leaving anyone behind had earned him the respect of recruits and generals alike. James thought back to the stories of MSGT Davis's heroism, particularly one mission in Colombia. Ambushed by the FARC, Davis had carried a young platoon leader to safety despite being told the lieutenant was already dead. The memory of Davis's unshakable resolve inspired James as he focused on regaining control of the situation. James straightened slightly, testing his balance. His captor's grip loosened, and he prepared to turn the tide. Davis had responded to the medic's grim assessment with quiet determination. Maybe so, he had said, hoisting the lieutenant onto his shoulders, but he's coming home with us. The medic stared at him, dumbfounded, clearly thinking Davis had lost his mind. The trek back to the landing zone was over 5 kilometers through dense jungle, teeming with potential threats. Carrying a seemingly lifeless body only increased the risk. Anticipating the medic's thoughts, Davis added, I'd do the same for you, Johnny. Stay close in case I need you. What followed became the stuff of legend. Against all odds, they made it back to the base intact. The medic reported the lieutenant's death to the doctor, who nodded and began a routine examination. Shining a penlight into the young officer's eyes, the doctor watched as the pupils contracted. The medic's jaw dropped in disbelief as the dead lieutenant was rushed into surgery. Davis's resolve had given the man another chance at life. Davis was a timeless figure, quiet, deliberate, and commanding respect without ever demanding it. In an age of shortcuts and throwaways, he was none of those things. Meticulously crafted and resolutely principled, he had a particular fondness for James and his engineering team. During the long lulls between missions, Davis had taken the time to teach them practical hand-to-hand combat techniques. Better to know something than to need it and not have it, Davis had explained, his voice steady but firm. I get it. The worst thing you're likely to face is a jammed printer or a bad paper cut. But if you stay in this line of work, you might find yourself in some interesting locations with even more interesting inhabitants. When that day comes, it's good to have some tools you can count on. That said, here's hoping a paper cut remains the scariest thing you ever deal with. Now, as James regulated his breathing and subtly resisted his captor's grip, he replayed Davis's lessons in his mind. One, in particular, stood out. Even when you're taking a beating, you can fight back. You just have to outthink your opponent. Give me the phone, James, Chris growled, his smug face inches from James's. You know the truth now. I've been with your wife, and so has every guy on the team. Stop pretending you're anything but a weak little nerd. Play along, and maybe, just maybe, you'll still get your turn with Linda when the rest of us are done with her. Who knows? With the bonuses coming in, she might even buy you one of those fancy robots to keep you company. James bit down on the rage surging through him, refusing to react. Chris's gaze locked on the phone bulging from James's shirt pocket, and he reached for it with his right hand. In that moment, James made his move. Planting his right heel firmly, he drove it backward into his captor's shin. The man yelped in pain, his grip slackening as he stumbled. James broke free, flexing his arms to fully escape the hold. As his captor collapsed to the ground, crying out, James turned his attention to Chris. With precision honed by Davis's training, James rolled his shoulder and drove his fist squarely into Chris's face. The satisfying crunch of bone breaking was accompanied by a gush of blood from Chris's nose. The man hit the floor with a thud, momentarily stunned. James glanced down at his captor, John, who was now clutching his leg and whimpering about a possible fracture. Without hesitation, James stomped on John's foot, drawing a shrill scream. That should clear up any doubts, he remarked coldly. Chris, still on the floor, was attempting to rise, hands covering his ruined nose. James approached, leaning in close to whisper, "Looks like you took that one for the team." Then, without warning, he delivered a punishing strike to Chris's temple, sending him into unconsciousness. Adrenaline coursing through him, James scanned the room for Linda. Before he could react, he felt a sharp impact to his back and neck, driving him to one knee. Spinning around, he saw Linda standing there, wielding a cast-iron skillet. Her swing had missed its mark, grazing his side. James rose, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. He grabbed the pan from her hands, tossing it aside with a clatter. Linda, her tone now pleading, begged him to reconsider. "James, we can fix this. Think of the money. I'll stop everything. No more affairs, no more Chris. We can go back to how things were. Don't throw this all away." Rubbing the back of his head, James stared at her in astonishment. Her sudden shift in demeanor reminded him of the alien in the thing, a creature adapting to survive each new threat. The thought brought a smirk to his lips. Misreading his expression, Linda took a step closer, attempting to embrace him. James stopped her with a firm hand on her shoulder. For a moment, he hesitated, considering his next move. Then, with calculated precision, he drove his fist into her nose. The sickening crunch of cartilage breaking was followed by Linda's cry of pain as she collapsed to the floor. She clutched her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Why, James?" she sobbed. "Why would you hit me?" James's gaze was cold and unyielding. "Because I could," he replied flatly. James kept the recording going, determined to document the incident fully. He felt certain he had enough evidence to justify his actions, even if the situation might cast him in a harsh light. Recalling MSGT Davis's advice about staying decisive, James surveyed the room. John lay on the floor, clutching his leg and groaning in pain, while Linda sat nearby, trying in vain to stem the blood from her broken nose. James noted how he was the only one moving with purpose while the others remained frozen, giving him an odd sense of clarity amid the chaos. The success of taking control felt bittersweet. He silently gave credit to Davis, reflecting on the MSGT's teachings about how taking action, even under extreme pressure, could turn a situation around. Still, frustration boiled within him as he considered the aftermath. Chris's bruised ego, John's likely attempt to downplay his part, and Linda's web of deceit. The financial losses and missed opportunities due to their scheming gnawed at him. For a moment, he considered calling the police, but he decided to hold off. If he called too soon, he'd lose the chance to dig deeper into Linda's lies. He moved to kneel beside Linda, showing her how to pinch her nose properly to control the bleeding. "Hold it here," he said gruffly, his voice devoid of sympathy. As the adrenaline wore off, his limbs grew heavy, and he slumped into a chair across from her. He stared at the woman he thought he'd known so well, wondering how much of their life together had been built on lies. "How long, Linda?" he asked at last, his voice low but sharp. "How long has this been going on?" Linda dabbed at her nose with a tissue, her eyes defiant despite the situation. Does it matter, James? It's over now. It could have been worthwhile if you'd just gone along with it, but you've ruined everything. James leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. You call this worthwhile? All the lies, the betrayals? You think this is what success looks like? She sneered. Spare me the self-righteous act. Chris warned me about you, about your outdated morals and rigid worldview. He said you'd never understand what it takes to get ahead. James's jaw tightened. When, Linda? When did Chris give you this pearl of wisdom? Her lips curled into a mocking smile. Oh, you'd like to know, wouldn't you? Too bad you're always the last to figure things out. James let the silence hang, knowing she'd keep talking. Sure enough, she did. You want to know why I didn't stick to your precious little career advice? Because it didn't work. A few pats on the head, a couple of good jobs, that's all it ever got me. It wasn't until Grace stepped in that I learned how things really work for women in the workplace. James's brow furrowed. Grace? He asked, though he already dreaded the answer. Yes, Grace, Linda snapped. She taught me the ropes. Let's face it, James. Sleeping your way to the top isn't just effective. It's fun. You men are so easy to manipulate. Show a little cleavage, flash a smile, and you're putty in my hands. Even you. James's stomach churned as he absorbed her words. Keeping his composure, he asked, So, this all started with Chris? Linda rolled her eyes. You're so dense, James. I started at the company Christmas party my first year at Cromerica. You think Chris is special? He's just one of many. James's breath caught. George? George Hamilton? You've been with him too? Of course, she said, her tone matter of fact. George, Chris, John, the entire team, anyone who could help me get ahead. Why shouldn't I? It doesn't cost me anything, and it gets results. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a mocking tone. You men are all the same. Dangle a little temptation in front of you, and you'll do anything. Even you, James. You think you're different, but you're not. James clenched his fists, but he stayed calm, the phone still recording every word. And George knows what's going on here? Is he listening right now? Linda smirked. Of course. We called him on the way here. He's already working on a cover story with the team. Sure, they'll have to make the pitch without us, but trust me, they've got it under control. James shook his head in disbelief. If everything's so neatly wrapped up, why the strong-arm tactics? Why send Chris to confront me? Linda sighed. That was Chris's idea, the idiot. I told him to let me handle it. I could have come home, played the perfect wife, and left again without you suspecting a thing. But no, he had to play the alpha. And now look where that's gotten us. James stared at her, disgusted. You really think this is all fixable? It is, Linda insisted. I could have made the flight, salvaged the deal. But thanks to Chris, I'm stuck here cleaning up this mess. Well, you're not making that flight now, James replied coldly. A thought struck him, and his gaze hardened. Chris seemed pretty clued in to everything going on. I'm guessing you've got a transmitter on you. Turning to her, he spoke clearly and deliberately, as though addressing an audience. George, if you're listening, I'm about to call the cops. I'm sure there's enough here for a handful of felonies, not to mention fraud. That's a federal contract you're playing with, isn't it, Linda? The feds don't take kindly to extra effort. He let his words hang, waiting for a reaction. Sure enough, Linda's phone buzzed, the ringtone blaring hail to the chief. She hesitated before answering. George, she said, her voice suddenly subdued. I'll put you on speaker. George's smooth voice filled the room. James, let me start by apologizing. Chris's actions were a serious lapse in judgment. I assure you the board will address this decisively. James allowed himself a grim smile. Good to know, George. It's nice to see the board takes assault and fraud seriously. James, George began, his tone calm but calculated. These are unfortunate allegations. While lawyers might see this as a payday, no one here really wants to rock the boat. At worst, we might pay a fine. Chris and John could get slapped with some community service, and you'll likely end up divorced and half as wealthy. James's lips tightened. Do I detect the insertion of an or into this story, George? George chuckled lightly. Linda always said you were the clever one. But, even so, I'm still happier to have her on my team than you. Yes, James, there most definitely is an or. Let's call it a proposition. James's silence urged him on. Here's how I see it. Cromrika has, let's say, displaced you in your wife's affections. When you questioned that arrangement, you were treated poorly. Very poorly, George added, his voice dripping with mock concern. Poorly? James quipped. Shocking. George ignored the sarcasm. Suppose, instead of calling the police, as you suggested, we come to a more mutually beneficial arrangement. I've just sent a snap to Linda's phone, courtesy of one of my tech guys. It's a disappearing message, so you'd better take a good look. Linda, curiosity piqued, opened the message and turned the phone to James. His eyes widened as he read the words. Bank of Grand came in followed by an astonishing number. When does that land? James asked, his tone neutral. It's already there, George assured him. You'll find the account information in your email. Look, James, today's been rough for you. I get it, but let's not let emotion cloud the facts. Linda is an incredibly desirable woman. That said, you can't deposit feelings in a bank account, can you? James smirked faintly, mirroring George's clipped tone. One cannot. George pressed on. Cromrika will cover the costs of your divorce. Let's be realistic. There's no reconciliation happening here. Linda will file, taking only her personal belongings and her retirement. That's the deal. James pondered the choice. On one hand, he could stand on principle, expose the whole sordid mess, and deal with the fallout. On the other, George had just given him 5 million very compelling reasons to walk away. Does Cromrika have a medical team? James asked suddenly. George sounded momentarily confused. Yes, James. We have several physicians on retainer. Good, James replied. You'd better load a few into a limo and send them over to pick up your team. Then we're in agreement? George pressed. Tanya who? James deadpanned. Precisely, George said with satisfaction. Are we done, James? Goodbye, George, James replied, ending the call. He slid his phone into his pocket and shut off the recording app, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over him. Linda, still nursing her injuries, mustered a weak smile. I knew you'd see it our way, she said, her voice trembling but hopeful. We can still be friends with benefits, maybe, once this all blows over. She offered what she likely thought was her most radiant smile, but the bruises, blood crusting her chin, and swelling ruined the effect. James couldn't help but laugh quietly at the sight. Misinterpreting his amusement, Linda leaned forward to kiss him, but James extended his hand, stopping her in her tracks. Gently but firmly, he pushed her back until she landed on the couch with a thud. Do you really think I'd want to kiss you? James asked, his disdain evident. Linda flinched, hurt flashing across her face. Straightening, James declared, You've got until tomorrow to take whatever you want and get out. Walking toward the door, he paused beside John, who was still curled on the floor clutching his leg. How's the foot, John? James asked mockingly. It's broken, I think, John whimpered. Let's be sure, James said, delivering a sharp kick to John's groin. John let out a pained wail, collapsing fully onto the floor. James approached Chris, who had managed to sit up and was trying to mask his fear. Don't worry, Chris. I'm not going to hurt you, James said, his voice almost kind. Chris began to relax, but his relief evaporated as James's boot pressed down hard on his groin, sending him sprawling in agony. Satisfied, James left the room, got into his car, and drove aimlessly. Hunger gnawed at him, so he stopped at a fast food joint for a burger. After eating, he checked into a red roof near the freeway and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion overtaking him. The next morning, James awoke early despite the aches from the previous night's scuffles. Preparing a cup of weak motel coffee, he felt his phone buzz. It was a message from the mystery number. Sorry for yesterday. I can meet. TGIF at the mall, noonish. I'll wave you over to the bar. I'll be there, James replied, pouring the lukewarm coffee into a paper cup. Setting up his laptop, he reflected on a lesson from his college economics professor. Always maintain a contingency fund. With the professor's guidance, James had opened a Cayman Islands account, humorously dubbing it his go-to-hell fund. Over the years, he diligently saved, amassing nearly $50,000. Now, that fund was about to grow substantially. Logging into the secure banking portal, James transferred the bulk of Cromerica's payment into his personal account, leaving $100,000 behind as a buffer. Satisfied, he closed the laptop and prepared for his meeting. Arriving at TGIF just after noon, James spotted a well-dressed man about his age waving him over. The man's polished appearance and calm demeanor belied the tension of their meeting. "I assume you sent the text," James said, sliding into the seat across from him. The man nodded. "I'm sorry for how this turned out. There wasn't a clean way to tell you." James leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Why don't we start with who you are and how you're connected to Linda?" "I was on the team," the man began, his voice calm but laced with frustration. "I left the Army after 8 years. Got wounded in action and spent months recovering before they medically discharged me. About 6 months ago, I started at Cromerica and was assigned to Chris's team 3 months later. At first, everything seemed great. The team welcomed me warmly, and I thought I'd landed on my feet." James nodded, his gaze fixed on the stranger as he continued. "But the cracks started to show pretty quickly," the man said. "About 2 months in, Linda approached me. She's beautiful and incredibly persuasive. I'll give her that. When I noticed her wedding ring and brought it up, she just smiled and said you were okay with it." James's face darkened. "And were you?" "Not a chance," the man replied firmly. "I told her no, and that's when things changed. Suddenly, I was on the outs. Linda iced me out completely, and Chris made sure I got all the worst assignments. It didn't take long for me to realize what was really going on. I called a mutual friend, someone who knew you. When I told him what Linda had done, he was shocked. He said the James he knew would never be involved in something like this. That's when he asked me to let you know." James leaned forward. "Our friend?" he asked, though he had a suspicion. The man smiled faintly. "Mark Davis." James's expression softened at the name. "If I hadn't met Mark—" "He's one of a kind," the man agreed. "He helped me out of a tight spot back when I was a green LT. I owe him more than a few favors." James nodded. "Don't we both?" He took a deep breath before asking, "What are you going to do now?" The man shrugged. "I resigned yesterday. I couldn't stay after what Chris and Linda tried to pull. I figured the text to you was the least I could do." James let out a long sigh. "George laid it all out for me. I could go to the police, and sure, Chris, John, and Linda would face some legal trouble. But with Cromerica's lawyers, it would barely scratch the surface. Instead, we made a deal. Maybe you think I sold out. Maybe I did. But they stole something irreplaceable from me. If I can't get justice legally, I'll settle for my own version of it. Linda, she's not as irreplaceable as I once thought." "And Cromerica?" the man asked. "I'm done with them," James said flatly. "I'm taking a trip. Tell Mark thanks for everything. I won't be going back to work." The man smiled faintly. "Well, Mark always spoke highly of Baxter Incorporated. They might be looking for another engineer now that you're gone." James chuckled. "Baxter's different. Tougher, more honest. Not as many perks as Linda's team was offering, though." "No complaints from me," the man replied, standing. James followed suit, and the two exchanged a nod before parting ways without another word. 9 months later, James was seated at his favorite table in a small cafe in northern Costa Rica, the deep blue of the Pacific glinting in the distance. Maya, the cafe's waitress, set down a cerveza with a warm smile. "Gracias, Maya," James said, raising the bottle to his lips. A bulky envelope sat on the table, the sender unknown. It had arrived at his modest home 2 days earlier, and while he was fairly certain it wasn't dangerous, he hadn't opened it yet. His first thought was George or Linda's people. Finding him in this quiet Pacific town wouldn't be impossible, but it would require resources. He decided to let Luis, the cafe's owner, handle it. "Luis, ¿tienes tu cuchillo?" James called out. "Sí, Señor James," Luis replied, handing him a knife. James stepped back as Luis carefully sliced open the envelope. Inside were several sheets of paper and a note. Picking up the note, James read, "Thought you'd find this interesting. Below it was a phone number. He immediately thought of Mark. If anyone could track me down, it's him, James mused. Turning to the other papers, James froze. A newspaper article, with a photo prominently displayed, stared back at him. It showed Chris, John, Linda, and Grace being escorted out of Cramerica's headquarters in handcuffs. The headline read, "4 indicted in multimillion-dollar procurement fraud." A slow smile spread across James's face. Maybe George's lawyers weren't as invincible as he thought, James murmured to himself. Talking to himself had become a habit. His Spanish was still weak, and he liked the sound of English, even if it was just his own voice. "Maya, otra cerveza, por favor," he called out, holding up his empty bottle. "Si, Mr. James," Maya replied, setting a fresh bottle in front of him. "Gracias," he said, tipping the bottle back and letting the cold beer slide down his throat. As he gazed out at the endless expanse of the Pacific, the corners of his mouth lifted again. "Linda who?" he muttered, raising his bottle in a silent toast to the ocean.